This isn't a story about ghosts, not the usual kind anyway. This is the story of a woman who was supposed to become one, a warrior of the Chiricahua Apache, betrayed not by a bullet, but by a belief. Left for dead by her own tribe after a tragedy stole her legs, her story should have ended there, whispered into the wind. But the wind carried her cries to the one man who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove to himself. A lone cowboy whose own ghost haunted the quiet corners of his desolate ranch. This is the story of Nita and Franklin Hayes, and it's a testament to the fact that sometimes the only tribe that matters is the one you build in the ashes of the life you lost. The sun was a merciless god, hammering the anvil of the Dragoon Mountains. For Nita, a warrior of the Chiricahua people, this was the breath of life. The heat that cooked the air was a familiar blanket. The scent of pinon and dust was the perfume of home. She moved with the fluid grace of a hunter, her moccasins making no sound on the rocky earth. She was not just a woman. She was a provider, a protector. Her skill with a bow and knife had earned her a respect that transcended gender, a respect that burned in the gut of men like Goklayir. Her father, a great warrior named Dai, had taught her the ways of the warrior, seeing in her a spirit fiercer than any of his sons. He saw the fire. Goklayir saw only a challenge to his own ambition. Today was a day of consequence, the great buffalo hunt. For weeks, scouts had tracked the herd, a dark, moving sea of life that promised sustenance for the coming winter. The survival of their band, led by the aging but still formidable Chief Cochise, depended on this hunt. Nita rode her paint pony, its muscles bunched and ready, a quiver of carefully fletched arrows tight on her back. Beside her rode Goklayir, a warrior whose ambition was as sharp and dangerous as the obsidian tip of his spear. He respected Nita's skill, but he saw her as an anomaly, a disruption to the natural order. His gaze often held a flicker of something cold, a resentment that she held a place of honor he felt should belong to a man. He watched the way the younger warriors, like Taza, looked at her with awe, and his jaw would tighten. He believed a woman's place was at the fire, not at the head of a hunt, but Cochise trusted her, and that was a stone in Goklayir's shoe he could not shake loose. "The spirits are with us today," Cochise had said that morning, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "The wind speaks of a successful hunt." Nita had nodded, touching the small medicine pouch at her belt. She felt it too, a thrum of energy in the earth, a promise of blood and meat and life for her people. The plan was simple, brutal, and effective. A group of riders, Nita among them, would spook the herd from the west, driving them toward a narrow concealed arroyo where the rest of the hunters waited. It was a dance of controlled chaos they had performed countless times, a dance Goklayir felt he should be leading. The signal came, the cry of a hawk, imitated perfectly by a scout on the ridge. Nita kicked her pony forward, her own voice joining the chorus of shouts that startled the grazing beasts. And then the ground began to tremble. It started as a low rumble, a vibration felt in the teeth, and grew into a thunderous roar. The sea of brown fur and horns began to move, a living avalanche of muscle and panic. Nita was in her element. She weaved her pony through the chaos, her arrows flying true, each one finding its mark behind the shoulder of a running buffalo. She was a part of the storm, her heart pounding in rhythm with the hooves that shook the world. She moved with a speed and precision that left even Goklayir in her dust, his face a dark mask of fury as he saw her take down beast after beast. He spurred his own horse faster, recklessly, trying to outdo her, trying to prove his own prowess. But Nita was a force of nature. And then, in a heartbeat, the sky betrayed them. It happened without warning. A section of the rocky cliff overlooking the arroyo, weakened by a recent flash flood and now shaken by the seismic stampede, gave way. It wasn't a small slide. It was a wall of rock and earth, a piece of the mountain itself tearing loose. It fell not into the arroyo, as would have been fortunate, but directly into the path of the flanking riders. Panic erupted within the panic. Horses screamed, veering wildly to avoid the cascade of death. A young warrior was crushed instantly, his cry swallowed by the roar of the stampede. Nita's pony, agile and sure-footed, made a valiant leap to the side, its hooves scrabbling for purchase on the unstable ground. It might have made it. It should have made it. But another horse, riderless and mad with fear, slammed into its flank. Nita was thrown. She landed hard, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. She tried to push herself up, her mind still sharp, her warrior instinct screaming to find cover. But she couldn't move her legs. She looked down, and her world ended. A massive slab of red sandstone, the size of a small cart, had pinned her from the hips down. She felt no pain. Not yet. There was only a terrifying, disconnected numbness. The herd thundered past, their massive bodies missing her by inches, the wind from their passing a hot, foul breath on her face. The dust was a choking shroud, the noise a physical blow. And when the last of the buffalo had passed and the dust began to settle, she heard the voices of her people. She thought she was saved. She was wrong. Goklier was the first to reach her. He looked down, his face a mask of grim assessment. He saw the rock, the unnatural angle of her body, the blood already beginning to pool in the dust. "The rock has taken her leg," he said to Cochise, who had arrived moments later, his face etched with horror. There was a strange note in Goklier's voice. Not sorrow, something closer to satisfaction. Nita tried to speak, but only a dry rasp emerged. "Help me," she mouthed, her eyes pleading with her chief. A debate, low and urgent, began around her. The medicine man, old and bound by tradition, examined her. He shook his head slowly. "Her lower body is gone. She is already walking the spirit road, even if her breath remains. To move the rock is to release her spirit completely." It was a death sentence spoken as a spiritual diagnosis. "We cannot stay here," Gauklier argued, his voice cutting through the hushed grief. His words were sharp, practical, and cruel. "The soldiers are never far. We have our meat, but we must move. We cannot carry a body that still breathes. It is bad medicine. It will bring a curse upon us." He was invoking a deep-seated Apache belief, a powerful taboo. A person with such a catastrophic injury was already in the hands of the spirits. To interfere, to carry this broken vessel with the tribe, was to invite misfortune, to tether a restless, suffering ghost to the living. It was a tradition born of harsh necessity, a way to ensure the survival of the many at the cost of the one. And Goklier wielded it like a weapon. "She is a warrior," a younger brave named Tassa protested, his eyes flashing with defiance. "She is Nita. We do not leave our own." "What she was is a warrior," Goklier countered coldly, his gaze sweeping over the assembled hunters. "Look at her now. She is a burden we cannot afford. Would you have us all starve or be captured for the sake of one who is already dead? Her spirit is strong. It will find its way. It is our way, the hard way, but the only way." Cochise looked from Gauklier's unyielding face to Nita's, whose eyes were wide with a dawning, unspeakable terror. The numbness in her legs was beginning to recede, replaced by a deep, crushing pressure that was the prelude to an agony she could not yet comprehend. She saw the conflict in her chief's eyes, the love for her, the daughter of his friend, warring with the crushing weight of leadership and the iron grip of tradition. He knelt, his old hand touching her forehead. His eyes were filled with a profound sorrow. "Your spirit has been chosen for a different path, Nita," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Forgive us. We do what we must to survive." They performed the leaving ritual, a quick, hollow ceremony. They chanted a prayer for her spirit's swift journey. They left her a small water skin and a piece of dried meat, tokens for a journey she was meant to take in the afterlife, not the physical one. It was a gesture of respect for the warrior she had been, not a provision for the woman who still lived. One by one, they turned away. Taza was the last to leave, his face a portrait of shame and fury. He couldn't meet her eyes. He and Goklier exchanged a heated glare, a promise of future conflict. But today, tradition and fear won out. Then they were gone. The sounds of their departure, the shuffle of ponies, the creak of travois laden with meat, the quiet weeping of her friends, all faded into the vast silence of the desert. She was alone. The sun beat down, and the pain, a colossal, fiery beast, finally awoke. It roared up from her shattered pelvis, a tide of pure agony that consumed her. She screamed, a raw, animal sound that the uncaring rocks swallowed whole. She screamed until her throat was raw, until consciousness became a frayed thread. Her world narrowed to the crushing weight on her legs, the burning sun on her face, and the soul-shattering realization that her people, her tribe, her entire world had left her for dead. Franklin Hayes believed in routines. They were the fence posts that kept his life from collapsing into the wilderness of his own grief. Wake before dawn, coffee black and bitter. Check the stock, 7 lean longhorns and a stubborn mule named Barnaby. Mend the fences. Work the small patch of land by Sycamore Creek that he had bled for. Eat. Clean his rifle. Stare at the empty chair by the hearth where his wife, Martha, used to sit. Sleep if the ghosts allowed it. His ranch wasn't much, just a small defensible cabin in a corral nestled in a fold of the hills, miles from the nearest town of Purgatory Flats. But it had water, the lifeblood of the territory, and it was his. He'd come west after the war, the horrors of Antietam and Gettysburg seared into his memory, hoping to build a new life. He'd found it, for a time, with Martha and their son, Thomas. Then the fever had come 3 years ago, a silent, merciless thief, and taken them both within a week. Now all he had was the land, the work, and the silence. The silence was the hardest part, a silence so loud it screamed with the voices of the dead. On this day, the routine was broken by a missing calf. A new one, barely a month old, had likely wandered off, drawn by some curiosity that would probably get it killed. With a sigh, Franklin saddled his buckskin mare, grabbed his rifle, and set out, following the creek bed as it snaked up toward the mountains. The land was telling a story he knew well. A large party had passed through recently, Apache by the looks of the unshod pony tracks and the way they moved through the terrain, leaving as little sign as possible. He tensed. His relationship with the local tribes was one of mutual, distant avoidance. He didn't bother them. They didn't bother him. Still, a large, well-armed party on the move was cause for concern. He was about 2 miles from his cabin when he heard it. At first, he thought it was a coyote caught in a trap, but it wasn't. It was a faint, rasping moan, a sound of such profound suffering it made the hairs on his arms stand up. It was the kind of sound he hadn't heard since the field hospitals of the war, a sound a man never forgets. He dismounted, rifle held at the ready, and moved cautiously toward the sound, every instinct on high alert. He crested a small rise and looked down into the area where the rock slide had occurred a day or two before. He saw the disturbed earth, the scattered rocks, the dry, dark stains that spoke of a hunt and of death. And he saw her. At first, he thought she was a corpse, another victim of this harsh land. Then her head moved, a slight, pained motion. He edged closer. She was Apache, that was clear from her buckskin dress and her features. Her black hair was matted with dust and blood. A water skin lay empty beside her. And then he saw the rock. Franklin's blood ran cold. He understood the scene in an instant. The stampede, the rock slide, the catastrophic injury, and the leaving. He'd heard stories from other settlers, tales of the Apache's harsh survivalist code. He'd never seen the result of it up close. He approached slowly, making sure his hands were visible. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and calm, though he knew she likely didn't understand him. Nita's eyes fluttered open. They were black, deep, and filled with a feverish, defiant fire. When she saw him, a white man, a Pinda Likoyi, a spark of pure hatred burned through the haze of her pain. She tried to reach for the knife still sheathed at her belt, but the movement sent a bolt of agony through her, and she fell back with a guttural cry. Franklin stopped. This was the moment of decision. The smart thing to do was to turn around, ride away, and forget what he saw. Bringing an Apache, especially a grievously wounded one, to his cabin was inviting a world of trouble. Her tribe might come looking for her, not to rescue her, but to finish the job and kill him for interfering. The folks in Purgatory Flats, especially the land-hungry rancher, Bartholomew Shaw, would brand him a traitor, an Indian lover, and use it as an excuse to run him off his land. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at him to leave. But then he looked at her face, contorted in a mask of pain, and he didn't see an Apache warrior. He saw a human being left to be eaten alive by the sun and the coyotes. He saw the same helpless agony he'd seen in Martha's eyes as the fever consumed her. He saw the small, still form of his son. He had been powerless to save them. He had been forced to stand by and watch his world die. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't powerless now. Damn it all to hell, he muttered to himself. The ghosts of his past wouldn't let him walk away. He couldn't. The first task was the rock. It was immense. He spent the better part of an hour with a long, sturdy log he found nearby, using a smaller rock as a fulcrum. He strained, his muscles screaming in protest, the sweat pouring down his face. Finally, with a great groaning heave, he managed to shift the stone slab just enough to pull her free. The sight beneath was grim. Her legs were a mangled ruin of shattered bone, torn muscle, and shredded buckskin. The stench of infection was already setting in. He knew with the certainty of a man who had seen too much battlefield carnage that the legs could not be saved. It was amputation or a slow, agonizing death from gangrene. He fashioned a makeshift travois from two long poles in his saddle blanket. Gently, carefully, he lifted her. She weighed next to nothing. She had been conscious through the ordeal with the rock, her teeth clenched, silent tears streaming down her dusty cheeks. But the movement and the fresh wave of pain finally pushed her over the edge into blackness. The journey back to the cabin was a slow, grim procession. Franklin led his mare, constantly looking back at the still figure on the travois. The silence he had come to dread was now filled with a purpose that both terrified and invigorated him. He had just invited the wilderness in its most raw and dangerous form into his home. The ghost of Sycamore Creek now had a companion. He got her inside and laid her on his own bed, the one he and Martha had built together. He cut away the ruined buckskin, his hands surprisingly gentle. He cleaned the wounds as best he could with whiskey and boiled water, his face set in a grim mask. She was burning with fever, her breathing shallow. He knew what he had to do. He went to the small chest where he kept his past. Beneath his folded Union uniform and a tintype of his family, he pulled out a leather roll. He unrolled it on the table. Inside were the tools of a Civil War field surgeon, a bone saw, clamps, and sharpened knives. He had been a hospital steward, tasked with the gruesome work of holding men down while the surgeon did his work. He had learned by watching, by holding shattered limbs, by hearing the screams. He spent the rest of the day boiling the instruments, sharpening the saw, and drinking a steady amount of whiskey himself. Not for courage, but to numb the part of him that was screaming at the butchery he was about to perform. As dusk fell, he lit every lamp in the cabin. He looked at the unconscious woman on his bed. "Lord, forgive me for what I'm about to do," he whispered to the empty room, "and forgive me if I do it wrong." He took a deep breath, picked up a whiskey-soaked rag to hold over her mouth in case she woke, and began the work that would either save her life or end it. Nita awoke to a world of white fire. The agony was a living entity, a predator that had consumed her legs and was now gnawing its way into her soul. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Not the sun-scorched earth, not the spirit road. She was in a small room made of wood, the air thick with the smell of pine, coffee, and something else, the coppery tang of her own blood. She tried to sit up, and a scream tore from her throat as the movement sent lightning bolts of pain shooting through her body. Her eyes shot down to her legs, covered by a rough wool blanket. She threw it off and saw. Below her knees there was nothing. Only thick, crude bandages, stained dark with blood, wrapped around the stumps of her legs. A guttural wail of pure animal despair erupted from her, a sound of such profound loss it seemed to shake the very logs of the cabin. Her legs, her speed, her grace, her ability to hunt, to dance, to walk the earth as a free woman, gone. She was no longer Nita, the warrior. She was a broken thing, a piece of a person. The cabin door opened, and the white man, the Pinda, entered. He carried a bowl of thin broth. He stopped when he saw her awake, saw the look in her eyes. It was a look of pure, undiluted hatred, a feral glare that promised death. He set the bowl down on a small table. well out of her reach, and held his hands up in a placating gesture. "Easy," Franklin said softly. "You've been feverish for 3 days. You need to eat." Nita spat at him, the saliva falling short. She spoke in her own tongue, her voice a raw rasp. "I will kill you. When my brothers find me, they will cut out your heart and feed it to the dogs." Franklin didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He just nodded slowly. "I expect they'll try," he said, his voice weary. "But they left you." "I didn't." He left the bowl and retreated, closing the door behind him, the weight of her hatred settling on his shoulders like a shroud. For the next week, this became their routine. He would enter, bring her food and fresh water, and tend to her wounds. She would meet him with a barrage of Apache curses, with glares that could curdle milk, and with any object she could get her hands on to throw. A cup, a spoon. She once managed to fling the bowl of stew at him, spattering his chest. He never reacted with anger. He would simply clean up the mess, his face impassive, and leave her alone again. Her rage was a shield against the crushing despair. As long as she could hate him, she didn't have to face the terrifying emptiness of her new reality. He was her jailer, the man who had mutilated her, the architect of her new prison. In her fever-addled mind, he was no different from the rock that had crushed her. For Franklin, it was a penance. Her hatred was something he felt he deserved, though not from her. He deserved it for surviving when Martha and Thomas hadn't. He took her abuse with a stoic patience that bordered on self-flagellation. He slept in the barn with Barnaby the mule, giving her the cabin, entering only to provide care. He talked to her constantly, not expecting an answer, but simply to fill the silence that had haunted him for 3 years. "The creek's running high today," he'd say while changing her bandages. "Good for the corn. Martha, she always said I planted too much corn." Or, "Saw a hawk this morning. Big red tail, reminded me of." Well, it was just a hawk. Nita listened, her stony silence her only weapon. She began to understand words. Water, eat, hurt, sorry. That last one he said often. Sorry. What did he have to be sorry for? For saving her? For cutting off her legs to do it? She didn't want his sorrow. She wanted her legs back. But slowly, through the fog of her anger, she started to see things. She saw the way his eyes would linger on the small empty chair by the fire. She saw the deep lines of grief etched around his mouth. She saw that his silence was as loud as her own. She was trapped in a broken body. He was trapped in a broken life. The turning point came not with a word, but with a nightmare. 2 weeks into her recovery, the fever had mostly broken, but the phantom pains began. She would dream she was whole again, running with the hunters, her legs powerful beneath her. Then she would wake up to the horrifying truth, and the ghosts of her limbs would scream with an agony that was all too real. She woke up thrashing, crying out, convinced she was back under the rock, the buffalo thundering over her. She rolled from the bed, landing hard on the floor, the impact sending searing pain through her stumps. Franklin burst in, awakened by her screams. He saw her on the floor, gasping and sobbing, her eyes wide with terror. He rushed to her side, not to restrain her, but to help. "It's all right," he said, his voice urgent. "You're safe. It's just a dream." Instinctively, Nita clawed at him, her nails scratching his arm. He winced but didn't pull away. Instead, he gently took her by the shoulders. "Nita," he said. He had learned her name from the delirious whispers in her fever. "Nita, you are safe here." Something in his voice, in his touch, broke through her wall of rage and terror. For the first time, she wasn't looking at a white man, an enemy. She was looking into the eyes of someone who understood pain. His eyes, she realized, held the same haunted, hollowed-out look she saw in the faces of warriors who had lost their families in raids. He was scarred, just like her, but his scars were on the inside. Her fight drained away, replaced by a wave of shuddering sobs. She collapsed against him, her tears soaking the front of his shirt, and wept for her lost legs, for her lost life, for the tribe that had abandoned her. Franklin just held her, patting her back awkwardly, his own ghost swirling around him. In that moment, they were not Apache and white man. They were simply two survivors, clinging to each other in the dark. After that night, the silence in the cabin changed. It was no longer a weapon, but a space they began to fill. Communication was a clumsy dance of gestures and single words. She would point to the fireplace and say, "Co," the Apache word for fire. He would nod and say, "Fire." He would point to the sky and say, "Sky." She would reply, "Yeah." She began to heal. Franklin was meticulous in his care, keeping the wounds clean. The physical pain began to dull into a constant, manageable ache. She learned to move, to drag herself from the bed to the chair by the fire, her arms and shoulders strengthening into coiled steel. One afternoon, a threat from the outside world intruded on their fragile peace. Two riders approached the cabin. Franklin saw them coming, and his face hardened. "Stay inside," he told Nita, his voice low. "Don't make a sound." He stepped onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in his hands. The men were Bart Shaw's hired muscle, Wes and Lonnie. They were rough men with mean eyes and cruel, downturned mouths. "Hayes," Wes grunted, spitting tobacco juice near Franklin's boot. "Mr. Shaw sent us. He's getting mighty thirsty over on his spread. Says this creek of yours is looking awfully full." "This creek is on my land," Franklin said, his voice even. "Deeds filed proper in Tucson. You tell Mr. Shaw to mind his own property." "Mr. Shaw figures what's his is what he can take," Lonnie sneered, his hand drifting near the pistol on his hip. "And he's heard some funny stories. Stories about you keeping company you shouldn't be keeping." "My company is my own," Franklin said, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. From inside, Nita watched through a crack in the door. She saw the two men, their aggressive postures, the way their eyes scanned the property with greedy intent. She understood threat, and she saw Franklin standing alone against them. Wes's eyes flicked to the cabin. "Smells like engine in there, Hayes. You harboring a redskin? That's a good way to get yourself burned out." As Lonnie took a step forward, a sudden sharp thwack echoed from the side of the cabin. A small rock, thrown with incredible force and accuracy, struck a metal bucket hanging by the barn, making it clang like a gunshot. Wes and Lonnie jumped, their hands flying to their guns, their eyes darting toward the source of the sound. It was a perfect distraction. In that split second of confusion, Franklin raised his rifle, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "I think you boys were just leaving," he said, his voice deadly calm. Wes and Lonnie exchanged a nervous glance. They were bullies, not fools. The odds had just shifted. They hadn't seen who threw the rock, but the woods were suddenly full of menace. They backed their horses up slowly. "This ain't over, Hayes," Wes growled. "Mr. Shaw gets what he wants." They rode off, kicking up dust. Franklin waited until they were out of sight before lowering his rifle, his shoulders slumping slightly. He turned and went back inside. Nita was sitting by the hearth, her face impassive. A small pile of smooth palm-sized rocks sat on the floor beside her. She didn't look at him, but her message was clear. She had chosen a side. Franklin looked at her, then at the rocks, and a slow smile touched his lips for the first time in a very long time. "Reckon I owe you one," he said. Nita just nodded, a flicker of something new in her eyes. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't pity. It was the first spark of partnership. The incident with Shaw's men created a subtle but profound shift. The shared threat had forged a bond stronger than any words they had yet learned. Franklin no longer saw Nita as a patient, a burden he had taken on out of guilt. He saw a partner, a survivor whose spirit was far from broken. Nita, in turn, began to see past the white face of her rescuer to the steadfast man beneath. He had not flinched, had not backed down. He had protected their home. The thought was as startling as it was comforting, but Franklin saw the frustration that gnawed at her. She was a creature of the open sky, now confined to the four walls of his cabin. He would watch her stare out the window for hours, her eyes tracking the flight of an eagle or the distant movement of deer, a deep, painful longing etched on her face. Her powerful arms allowed her to pull herself around the cabin floor, but to go outside meant dragging her body through the dirt, a slow and demeaning process she undertook only when absolutely necessary. One morning he came in from the corral with a determined look in his eye. "This isn't right," he said, more to himself than to her. A cage is a cage, no matter how safe. He disappeared into the small barn that served as his workshop. Nita could hear him all day, the sound of sawing and hammering echoing across the small yard. He was a rancher, not a carpenter, and the sounds were often punctuated by frustrated curses. He emerged at sundown, covered in sawdust, dragging a strange contraption behind him. It was crude, ugly, and utterly brilliant. He had taken the seat from a broken buckboard wagon and mounted it low between two large wheels he'd scavenged from an old piece of farm equipment. In front of the seat, he'd attached a smaller, pivoting wheel for steering. It was essentially a low-riding, three-wheeled chair, a frontier wheelchair built of scrap wood, stubbornness, and empathy. "It ain't pretty," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "But the wheels turn. Thought maybe it would be better than the floor." Nita looked at the device, her expression unreadable. Franklin's heart sank a little, thinking he'd made a mistake, that he'd insulted her with this clumsy offering. He started to stammer an apology, but she held up a hand to silence him. Slowly, using her immense upper body strength, she maneuvered herself from the cabin doorway and onto the seat. Her hands found the rims of the large wheels. She gave a tentative push. The chair lurched forward a few feet and stopped. She tried again, coordinating her pushes, learning the balance and the feel of it. A few more jerky movements, and then she began to move with a growing confidence. She rolled it off the porch and onto the hard-packed dirt of the yard. She turned it in a circle, her movements becoming smoother, more fluid. She rolled it toward the creek, the wind lifting her long black hair from her shoulders. She was outside. She was moving. She was not walking, no, but she was no longer crawling. She stopped at the creek bank and looked back at him. For the first time since he had found her, a true, genuine smile spread across her face. It transformed her, chasing the shadows from her eyes. In that smile, Franklin saw the warrior she had been and the unyielding woman she still was. The sight was more beautiful than any sunrise he had ever witnessed. Her world expanded. The chair became an extension of her body. It was difficult, exhausting work to propel it over the uneven ground, but it was a freedom she hadn't dared to dream of. She began to reclaim pieces of herself. She couldn't track a deer for miles, but she could sit hidden in the brush near a game trail, her bow in her lap, and wait with a patience Franklin could only marvel at. Her arrows, fletched with a skill he'd never seen, began to supplement their food supply with rabbit and quail. She taught him things. She showed him how to read the land in ways he never knew, to see the subtle signs of water, of animal movements, of the changing weather. She taught him which plants were medicine and which were food, crushing leaves in her hands for him to smell. He, in turn, taught her more English. Their conversations grew from single words to halting sentences, a new language forged between them. He learned of her life before, of her father Dao Dai and the pride he had in her, of the cold ambition of Gauclair, of the deep, gut-wrenching shame of being left behind. She spoke of it without tears now, her voice low and hard like stone. She learned of his life, of Martha's kindness and laughter, of little Thomas's fascination with insects and the stars. He spoke of them with a quiet reverence, the pain still present, but softened by the act of sharing it. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, the silence now comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. They were two broken people who, together, were beginning to feel whole. But the world outside their small sanctuary had not forgotten them. Bart Shaw was a man who equated patience with weakness. He wanted Franklin's land, specifically the year-round water from Sycamore Creek. His own wells were running dry, and his massive herd was suffering. He had tried intimidation, and it had failed. Now he would turn to strangulation. One morning, Franklin went to the creek to fill their buckets and found it had slowed to a muddy trickle. "Nita!" he yelled, his voice sharp with alarm. She wheeled herself to the door. He didn't need to explain. The near-silent creek bed said everything. "Shaw," Franklin bit out, his jaw tight. "He's damned it upstream." He saddled his mare, his face a thundercloud. "I'm riding up there. This is my water, my right." "Wait," Nita said. It was one of the first times she had used the word to command him. She pointed to his rifle, then to herself, then back at the rifle. She wheeled herself to the cabin wall where a spare bow and a full quiver were hanging. With deliberate movements, she strapped the quiver to the back of her chair and laid the bow across her lap. Her meaning was clear. You are not going alone. Franklin hesitated for only a moment. The idea was insane. Taking a legless woman in a homemade chair into a confrontation with armed men. But then he looked at the set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes, and he knew two things. She would not be left behind, and he would be a fool to go without her. All right, he said with a nod. All right, we go together. He fashioned a leather tow rope from the barn, tying one end to his saddle horn and the other to the front of her chair. It was a strange sight, the cowboy on his horse pulling the Apache woman in her wheeled contraption behind him. But as they moved up the creek bed, following the muddy trail where the water used to be, there was nothing strange about it. There was only a grim, shared purpose. They were a tribe of two, riding out to defend their territory. The journey up the dry creek bed was slow and arduous. The wheels of Nita's chair sank into the soft mud, and Franklin had to dismount frequently to help pull her through the worst patches. They moved in silence, the only sounds the creak of the leather, the plodding of the horse, and their own strained breathing. The air grew heavy with a tension that was more than just the midday heat. They found the dam about a mile upstream, just past the boundary of Franklin's property. It was a crude but effective barrier of logs, rocks, and packed mud, thrown hastily across the narrowest point of the gorge. On the other side, the water pooled deep and still, a theft made manifest. Wes and Lonnie were there, along with two other hired guns Franklin didn't recognize. They were watering their horses, laughing and talking, confident in their work. Bart Shaw himself stood on a nearby rise, overseeing his victory, a portly man in a waistcoat that seemed out of place in the rugged landscape. Shaw spotted them first. His laughter died, replaced by a sneer. Well, look what the buzzards dragged in, boys. It's the farmer and his pet. Franklin pulled his horse to a halt, untying the tow rope. Nita maneuvered her chair into the shade of a large boulder, her movements quiet and deliberate. She was no longer a victim being pulled. She was a warrior taking a position. This is my water, Shaw, Franklin called out, his voice echoing slightly in the gorge. You know the law. Riparian rights. Goes with the land. Tear down that dam. Shaw chuckled, a rich, unpleasant sound. The only law out here, Hayes, is the law of who's got more men and more guns. And you, my friend, appear to be short on both. Now, I'll make you one last offer. Sign your deed over to me for $100, and I'll let you and your companion ride out of here with your lives. Refuse, and we'll just water our cattle on your grave. Wes and Lonnie fanned out, their rifles coming up. Franklin dismounted, using his mare for cover as he leveled his own rifle. The classic standoff, 4 guns against 1. The outcome seemed inevitable, but they weren't counting on Nita. From her position behind the boulder, she had a clear, angled view of the men. They were focused on Franklin, seeing her as a helpless cripple, an object of ridicule. They didn't see the bow in her lap. They didn't see the arrow she had silently knocked to the string. Her target was not a man. It was something far more strategic. High on the gorge wall above Wes, a large, precariously balanced rock jutted out, loosened by the same rains that had weakened the cliff face during the buffalo hunt. Last chance, Hayes, Shaw shouted. Franklin's mind raced. He could maybe take 1, maybe 2, but they would get him. It was a suicide play. He glanced toward Nita, a flicker of despair in his eyes. She met his gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It said, "Trust me." He turned his attention back to Shaw. "You'll have to kill me to take it, Shaw." It was the signal Nita needed. As Shaw opened his mouth to give the order to fire, she drew the bowstring back to her ear. The muscles in her shoulders and back, strengthened by months of propelling her own body weight, bunched. She released. The arrow flew, not with a deadly hiss, but with a high, arching grace. It wasn't aimed at flesh. It struck the gorge wall just beneath the precarious rock with a sharp crack. The impact, combined with the rock's own instability, was enough. With a grinding groan, the massive boulder tipped and fell. Wes looked up, his eyes wide with terror, a strangled cry dying in his throat. He didn't have time to run. The boulder crashed down, missing him, but landing with titanic force on the ground nearby. The impact shook the entire gorge. Wes was thrown from his feet, his rifle flying from his hands. The distraction was total. All eyes, including Franklin's, jerked toward the crash. In that instant, Nita had another arrow knocked. This one flew straight and true, burying itself deep in the shoulder of the man standing next to Lonnie. He screamed and dropped his rifle, clutching the feathered shaft. Franklin reacted instantly. He fired not at a man, but at the ground in front of Lonnie's feet. The bullet kicked up a spray of dirt and rock fragments that stung Lonnie's face and sent his horse rearing in panic. The fight was over before it had truly begun. One man was wounded and screaming, another was disarmed and terrified, and Lonnie was fighting to control his panicked mount. It had all happened in less than 5 seconds. Shaw stared, his face pale, his jaw slack. His perfect plan, his overwhelming force, had been shattered by a woman in a chair and an arrow that hadn't even killed anyone. He looked from his rooted men to Nita, who was already knocking a third arrow. This one aimed squarely at his chest. He saw no hesitation in her eyes, only cold, lethal promise. He swallowed hard. "All right," he croaked, raising his hands. "All right, you've made your point." But the reckoning was not yet over. From the ridge above them, a new sound arose, the high, ululating cry of an Apache war party. Franklin's heart plummeted. He thought they were doomed, caught between two enemies. But as a dozen Chiricahua warriors on horseback appeared on the rim of the gorge, he saw they weren't looking at him. Their eyes were fixed on Nita. At their head rode Tasa, the young warrior who had protested leaving her. His face was a mask of disbelief and awe. He had been part of a small group that had defied Gauklayer. Racked with guilt, they had broken from the main band weeks ago to return to the site of the rockslide, to give Nita a proper burial and honor her spirit. They found the moved rock, the tracks of a shod horse and a travois, and they had been following the trail ever since, fearing they would find her body in a white man's camp, or worse. Instead, they found her alive. Not just alive, but fighting. A queen in her strange chariot, holding a half-dozen armed men at bay with nothing but a bow and an unbreakable will. They saw the white man, Franklin, fighting not against her, but with her. Taza let out a fierce cry, a call to his warriors, and they swept down into the gorge like a storm. It was not a battle for land or water. It was a battle for honor. They fell upon Shaw's remaining men with a terrifying fury. Shaw, Wes, and Lonnie, seeing the tide turn so completely, abandoned their wounded man and fled, riding for their lives. The Apaches did not pursue. They reined in their ponies, forming a semicircle around Nita and Franklin. The gorge fell silent, save for the moans of the wounded man and the gentle gurgle of the creek as a few of the warriors began tearing down the dam. Taza dismounted and walked toward Nita. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes taking in her bandaged stumps, her wheeled chair, and the fierce pride that still burned in her face. He dropped his gaze to the ground, a gesture of profound shame and respect. "Nita," he said in their native tongue, his voice thick with emotion. We were told your spirit had already departed. Gauklayer's path proved to be a dark one. His leadership led to a disastrous raid against the soldiers. Many were lost. Cochisi's heart was broken. We came back to find your bones, to ask forgiveness from your spirit." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "And we find you alive, a warrior still." He looked at Franklin, who stood wearily by his horse, his rifle held low. The Apache warrior's gaze was long and searching, devoid of its earlier malice. He saw not an enemy, but the man who had done what they had failed to do. "We are here to take you home, Nita," Taza said. "Your place is with the people. We will care for you. You will be honored." The offer hung in the air, heavy with history and obligation. Home. The word struck a chord deep within Nita, a longing for the familiar smell of the campfires, the sound of her own language spoken in laughter, the faces of her people. For a moment she saw it all clearly. A life of honor, yes, but also a life of dependence. She would be cared for, revered as a living legend, but she would be an icon, a symbol, not a partner. She would be Nita the survivor, her days spent telling stories, her life defined by the tragedy that had befallen her. She looked at the faces of Taza and the other warriors. They were her blood, her past. Then her gaze shifted to Franklin. He stood quietly, his face unreadable, leaving the choice entirely to her. He would not ask her to stay. He would not fight for her against her own people. He had given her back her life, and now he was giving her back her freedom in the truest sense of the word. She thought of the long, silent nights in the cabin that had slowly turned into nights of shared stories. She thought of the crude, beautiful chair he had built for her, not out of pity, but out of a deep, unspoken understanding of her need for dignity. She thought of his haunted eyes and how lately she had seen the ghosts in them begin to recede. Here in this small, quiet corner of the world, she was not a symbol. She was not a burden. She was a woman. She was a partner. She was half of a whole. Nita turned her gaze back to Tassa. She spoke, her voice clear and strong, resonating with a certainty that left no room for argument. "Shikias," she said, using the word for my friend with deep affection. "You honor me. My blood is Chiricahua, and my heart will always hear the songs of our people. But my home is no longer there." She gestured with her hand, a sweep that encompassed the small cabin in the distance, the creek that was beginning to flow freely again, and the quiet man standing beside his horse. "My old life ended beneath that rock," she continued, her voice softening slightly. "My legs are buried in that soil, but my spirit found new ground to grow in. Right here, this man." He did not see a broken Apache woman to be pitied or feared. He saw a person worth saving. When my own people left me to the spirits, he fought the spirits to bring me back. He did not try to make me a white woman. He helped me become Nita again. She wheeled her chair closer to Franklin, placing a hand on his forearm. He looked down at her, a world of emotion passing between them in a silent glance. "My tribe left me," she said, looking directly at Taza, her voice ringing with the finality of her choice. "So I have made a new one. He is my tribe." Taza stood for a long moment, the truth of her words settling over him. He saw the way she looked at Franklin, the way he stood by her side. It was a bond he could not break, and he knew he had no right to. He gave a slow, solemn nod. "The spirits work in ways we do not understand," he said. He then stepped forward and addressed Franklin directly, speaking in the broken English he had learned from traders. "You are a good man, Franklin Hayes. You have honor. Nita has chosen. We will not challenge this. You will not be troubled by us. Live well." With that, Taza turned, mounted his pony, and led his warriors away. They rode out of the gorge, leaving the wounded hired gun to his fate and the dam in ruins. They vanished as quickly as they had appeared, melting back into the landscape. Franklin and Nita were left alone in the sudden, profound silence. The creek whispered as it began its journey downstream again, back toward their home. Franklin looked at Nita, his heart full of a feeling he thought he would never experience again. It was more than gratitude, more than relief. It was peace. "A tribe of two," he said softly, a small smile playing on his lips. Nita smiled back, her hand still resting on his arm. "A tribe of two," she agreed. He tied the tow rope back to her chair, and they began the slow journey home. But this time it felt different. They weren't a man and his patient, or a cowboy and an Apache. They were Franklin and Nita. They were partners, survivors, founders of their own unique nation in the heart of a territory that had tried and failed to break them both. As they approached the small cabin, it stood not as a shelter from the world, but as the capital of their tiny, resilient kingdom, built on a foundation of scars, respect, and a love as rugged and enduring as the land itself. The story of Nita and Franklin Hayes doesn't appear in the official histories of the American West. There are no monuments to a lone cowboy or the warrior he refused to let die. Their legacy isn't written in books. It was written in the flowing waters of Sycamore Creek, in the shared warmth of a cabin hearth, and in the quiet strength of two people who found a future in the wreckage of their past. Their story reminds us that history isn't just about grand battles and famous names. It's about the profound, world-changing choices made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. It shows us that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about acting in spite of it, and that the strongest tribes are often the ones we build ourselves, forged in compassion and mutual respect. If their incredible story of survival and unlikely partnership moved you, please help us share it. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates tales of the true grit of the West, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories that bring the forgotten corners of history to life. Thank you for listening.